Escom was founded in 1991 by Manfred Schmidt. As an offshoot from his music company, it was previously known as Schmidt Computers Limited. Early on, the company sold Commodore 64 computers, but then it branched out into the IBM clone market, eventually rising to become the biggest PC manufacturer in Germany. Getting stock and reliable suppliers for a new company has always been challenging. When Escom first started, they were in desperate need of stock for the Christmas season of 1991. Manfred made a phone call to Commodore, and he was put in contact with Petro Tishchenko, who at the time was Commodore's global logistics director. Happy to sell them some product, Petro made sure they had an ample supply of C64s, just in time for the Christmas season. This really helped Escom from folding in those early days. Escom had a strong retail presence in Germany. They had dedicated stores with customer service, sales reps and displays. This may seem standard nowadays, but back in the 90s hardly anyone was selling out of retail units in Europe, apart from independent retailers and computer stores. In Germany they were operating 27 retail outlets, and were considered the world leader in computer retail sales at the time. The UK sales model was very much mail order based. There were some independent retail stores, and the main retail chain was PC World, with over 14 stores nationwide. Escom wanted to move into UK retail, and were well positioned, already operating plants in Germany and the Netherlands. They spotted an opportunity to enter the UK market when Rumbelows, the electronics retailer, folded. Bernard Van Tienen of Escom said, "People want to touch the machines before buying them, and they want to take them away immediately." Escom purchased 168 old Rumbelows stores and converted them into Escom retail units, eventually leading to Escom operating around 300 stores worldwide. With the Commodore 64 being one of the most popular computers in the world, Commodore was still the second biggest seller of PCs in retail volume when they went bankrupt in 1994. When they went bankrupt, many parties showed interest in purchasing Commodore and the Amiga assets. Samsung Electronics, Philips Electronics, Amstrad plc, Escom, Gateway, IBM, Acer, Commodore UK, New Star Electronics and Creative Equipment International. Commodore UK was still operating. They were working with New Star Electronics and Creative Equipment International on a bid. New Star Electronics, however, were doing a deal with Escom at the time and decided to pull out of the UK's bid. This left Commodore UK high and dry and they were no longer able to bid, leading Creative Equipment International to then decide to back Dell instead of Commodore UK. With so many parties involved, the auctioneer made sure everybody bidding would have to put down a £1 million deposit. So now the stage was set. It was between two bidders. In one corner we had Dell and Creative Equipment International, and in the other Escom and New Star Electronics. Escom also had a bit of behind the scenes pressure from IBM, who were really interested in Dell not getting hold of certain assets in the deal. Escom ended up winning the bidding process for only $12 million, even though Dell had bid $15 million. The creditors and lawyers decided this was only fair because Escom had been first to put their bid in and have it accepted. Dell, however, had set conditions, such as allow a 30-day waiting period to look over everything and decide if they wanted to keep it, which the creditors decided was unfair and would have restarted the whole process again. IBM and Escom had a close relationship after the buyout. They did many deals, and one of those deals turned out to be a fatal move for Escom. IBM managed to convince all the leading PC manufacturers like Vobis Microcomputer, Escom and Comtech that their operating system OS/2 Warp would garner over 40% of the German market, making it the country's biggest selling OS and beating Windows 95. All the German companies then proceeded to make preload agreements with IBM, preloading OS/2 Warp onto their machine. This became a fatal move for Escom, but we'll cover that later in part 2. Escom were originally not interested in the Amiga name, even though they talked a lot about the future in the buyout process. They seemed mostly interested in the Commodore name, as it was still the second biggest manufacturer of PCs at the time. So they split the brands and assets into two groups. The first group was Commodore Holdings BV, who owned the Commodore brand name and all the assets. They then packaged the Amiga brand and assets together for quick resale. However, after purchasing the Amiga, they got hounded by thousands of Amiga users, writing to them, phoning them, and they suddenly realised there was a huge, strong existing user base still out there. They decided to take the brand and assets and put them all underneath one name, and that would be called Amiga Technologies, and they made Petro Shishchenko the director. Maybe they could produce some more product and sell it to these users through the Escom retail stores. Now, the first move Petro did was insist that Amiga Technologies should operate as a viable business without any financial help from Escom, mainly making its money through sales of Amiga products and licensing the name and assets worldwide. When Escom purchased the Amiga, loads had to be put in place before they could begin operating again. The factories had been shut down and stockpiles of stock were all over the world. Amiga Technologies really wanted to define themselves and separate themselves from the Commodore Amiga period. This required a new image, a new design. They really wanted to depart from the old 80s tick logo. One of the areas Amiga was still relevant in Europe was presentations and fantastic software such as Scala. Scala was still a market leader in presentation software. Based in Europe, they had beautiful infographics, fantastic smooth scrolling fonts that really couldn't be matched by any other software at the time. So Amiga Technologies invited the designer Bjorn Rebranding from Scala to their opening press conference in Frankfurt to share his ideas with the public. He presented a new design for the Amiga 4000 tower case, and it was very different from the previous machines. The Amiga logo had been replaced with a new logo. It was the letter A in a highly abstracted form, a triangle. He then sliced the triangle into 3 bars, all of different lengths, and left a choice between using them horizontally or tilting them 60 degrees. Initially the logo was tilted until he realised that was essentially the Adidas brand logo. So instead, he favoured turning the logo horizontally, and the Amiga community reacted to this logo, often calling it the beehive or the Christmas tree. After a few days, Amiga Technologies received a letter from a Usenet user. He'd noticed that the logo was being used for the Church of Scientology's Dianetics program. Initially, some people within Amiga Technologies thought it might not be an issue, but eventually Peter Kittel of Amiga Technologies stated, "Now we have learnt that this is practically the Scientology logo, we won't use it." They then hired another designer, this time a company called Frog Designs, to create the Bondi font logo with the red square, leading many Usenet and Amiga users to question why they needed to hire a design agency for such a simple logo. Now, what did Escom do with the Commodore assets? Escom built a few rebranded PCs with the Commodore logo and sold them commercially. They were not very interesting, just beige boxes rebadged really. But they also created some quite cool and unique Commodore products. First, we have their attempt at an internet computer called the Commodore Webbit. It was essentially a 486 PC with internet access and a built-in C64 emulator. The last product they produced was an IBM compatible laptop called the F6000T in a nice form factor with a TFT screen. I've tried to find more information on Commodore's Escom machines, but it's really hard to find anything online. Amiga Technologies had rebranded, but they had a big task ahead of them. They had to get all the Amiga product back in one place as it was spread all around the world. The manufacturing plants had shut down, so they had to restart production at their French factory near Bordeaux. Displays were essential, especially seeing the Amiga had a different mode to other computers. They contacted Microvitec based in Bradford, England. They'd previously made Commodore compatible monitors, so they then produced 3 new models for Escom. They had to decide how to repackage and build these machines. First they started with the Amiga 1200. They first started producing them in France with, leftover stock, including old motherboards. They even used cheaper capacitors than Commodore, and the main change was that they added the 3.1 kickstart ROM, whereas the original Commodore machines only had the 3.0 kickstart ROM. They came up with 2 packages for the 1200. The first was the Amiga Magic package. This was a 1200 in a single box with 2 games, deluxe paint, WordWorth 2 processor, print manager. It was £500 and it came with an added hard drive. The other package was the Amiga Surfer package, which consisted of an Amiga 1200 with a hard drive, a modem, internet software, and the package was really interesting because it actually included the ability to connect to IBM's internet link with 100 hours free. To be closer to their huge amount of retail stores, they decided to move production into Irvine, Scotland, and that's where the trouble started. They started to make later revisions of motherboards, and that was really appreciated by the Amiga community. Amiga floppy drives were very specific. Amiga technology really struggled to find a supply of these drives and ended up using high density drives with a wire soldered to the motherboard to fix compatibility issues. The only problem was, it didn't fully fix them. It left the drives unable to read certain files or even write to disk. This led to many users hacking PC drives to work in the A1200 and many Escom fixers coming out in the community. In Scotland they started to produce Amiga 4000Ts. They changed the Commodore round and front and added a more square form factor to the tower. It still had 6MB of RAM, but they included a 1GB hard drive and a 060 processor running at 50MHz. However, due to Escom's increasing financial difficulties, the 4000T wasn't even advertised or displayed in any of their shops. It's rumoured to have only sold over 2,000 machines worldwide. Now, Escom had stores all over the UK and Germany, and they were proudly displaying the Amiga 1200 in the window. The only problem was none of the staff had training or knowledge of the machine. There's a fantastic article, The Truth About Escom, and it's written by Andrew Elliott, and it's from an Amiga fan's perspective inside Escom. I heard stories of many of the machines being displayed in the windows just showing the Kickstart loading screen, and this spurred Usenet users on to start a campaign of going into shops, showing them demos and educating the employees about their beloved machine. My experience personally was going into an Escom store with my father, overjoyed that they'd bought Amiga. I asked the sales assistant about the new Amiga Magic Pack. He looked at me blankly and pulled something from under the desk, asking, "One of these thingies?" Amiga sales were not the only thing that were going to help fund and research Amiga technologies. I can't imagine they sold many machines, especially seeing as they were a slight upgrade and there were lots of other machines available like the Saturn and the Sony PlayStation at the time. So Amiga technologies needed another income stream, and this was licensing the Amiga and the technology worldwide. This would be done through companies like QuickPax, VisCorp, NewStar, Virtual.io and Regent Electronics. I shall be covering their projects and companies in more detail in part 2. Now, surprisingly to everybody, Petro had managed to raise enough money to develop a prototype. Originally it was named the A12000 Plus, but then the machine got renamed to the Mindwalker, which interestingly was a name given to Voyager web browser rebranded for the Amiga Surfer Pack. The name got shortened later on to Walker. The whole idea of the Walker was it would be made from cheap replaceable, standard off-the-shelf PC parts. The motherboard would be replaceable and could fit into many different cases. Also, it could be a product of its own. It had a faster CPU, an 030/40 MHz, had expansion, new Kickstart ROMs and a CD drive. One of 2 Walker prototypes were presented to the world at CeBIT, and it got ridiculed by the press for being outdated, looking like Darth Vader's helmet, canine or a vacuum cleaner. You could really see what Petro was trying to do here. Maybe a few years earlier the Walker could have made it, but in the end they only produced 2 prototypes and now it's the stuff of legend. Hope you enjoyed the video. I shall be back with part 2 where I'll be covering the licensing that Amiga Technologies did, the cool machines that were created all around the world, and the collapse of Escom, and of course, Amiga buyout too. Ciao!